for being here. This is the launch of the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion. And we're not surprised that it's been really well received and lots of people have come to learn more about this book. It's a fantastic book and a really, really important topic. Fashion is political. From the red carpets of the Met Gala to online fast fashion, clothes tell a story of inequality, racism and the climate crisis. In the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion, investigative journalist Tansy Hoskins unpicks the threads of the capitalist industry to reveal the truth about our clothes. We're honoured to be joined tonight by Tansy in person, here, who will share with us some of the key insights and ideas in the book and talk to us about the degrowth, democratisation and decolonisation of the fashion industry. After which, we'll be able to ask Tansy some questions about her work and about the book. Also joining us tonight is our panel, Dr. Karen Dennis. Oh, sorry, there she is. Dr. Karen Dennis is the owner of Ketchup Clothes. Some of you might have seen the rack at the back. Designer and maker of unique recycled clothing. Lauren Cowdry, the director of Leeds Community Clothing Exchange. A community project that encourages the swapping of clothes. Dr. Esther Pugh, a senior lecturer at Leeds Business School and Leeds University, and Jo Wanner, the owner the owner of Trad Collective Ethical Clothing, which is in Headingley. I don't know if anyone's been to that yet. So, to kick off this fantastic event, please give an incredibly warm welcome to the author of the book, The Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion, Tansy Hoskins.
Thank you so much. Is it all right if I take this out here? So, yeah, first of all, hi Leeds. It's really, really awesome to be here. Last event I did just before the pandemic was at Leeds University, so I feel like kind of come full circle. Thank you so much, first of all, to this incredible place, to Leeds Left Bank and to Sue and to Sarah and to everyone who's worked so hard to put this event together. I feel really privileged and honoured to be here this evening, so thank you. I've got a few notes that I'm going to be referring to. I'm often like sort of ad-lib, but there's some quite important stuff that I'm going to be talking about that I didn't want to get wrong, so I'll be referring to that every now and again. The first thing I want to do is like a little bit of like interactiveness, which I hope people are up for. If you're not, just that's fine. I'm not going to pick on anyone or anything like that. But I want to highlight two of the central questions that I tried to build the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion around. And the purpose of these two questions is to show fashion, the fashion industry, as a performance of some of the deeper structural issues of our global society. So there's a kind of think experiment that the book begins with, and I want to just play it with all of you this evening. So it involves two questions. The first question is, what kind of society do you want to live in? I'm really echoey here, this is amazing. What kind of society do you want to live in? You know, maybe you want to make some like small tweaks, like, oh, I want to have like free dental care. Or maybe you're like, I don't want an unelected, undemocratic head of state or something like, you know, just something that you might think of. So, or you might want really big structural changes, like, you know, I don't want a meat industry, I don't want a prison industrial complex, these kind of things. Is anyone feeling like they'd like to put their hand up and say something that would be part of their ideal society that they'd like to live in?
A fully transparent society where we know where everything comes from, where it ends up, and where we're connected to the things we buy and the things we eat.
Cool, so yes, a greater transparency. Here.
Free childcare in every workplace.
Oh my God, free childcare. Between us, in just a couple of moments, you know, we've created a vision of a society, you know, where we have free healthcare, where we don't have profit in our, you know, in the things that we actually need, where we've got libraries everywhere and everything's transparent. It sounds much better than what we've got going on at the moment. So the second question that I then drop into that first question is, in this new society that we've built together, what is fashion for? You know, so in your like utopia, whether that's radically different or a little bit different. You know, what is fashion for? Like, is it to mark and celebrate the phases of the moon? Is it to attract people? Is it to repel people? You know, does anyone want to... Some of you guys are like going, yeah, go for it. Okay, cool. So basically, like, there's so many things that we could, you know, have fashion for. And I think you have really, like, summed it up beautifully. Freedom of expression of the individual to express yourself, regardless of, you know, class, race, gender, sexuality, all the labels that get stuck onto us at the moment. And so the point of this is to show that, like, what is fashion for at the moment? And what we know that fashion is for at the moment is to produce billions and billions and billions of dollars of profit for a very small cabal of like shareholders, essentially, who are generally from North America and Europe, and most of whom are not creatives. And no matter what you could think of as your ideal society, I very much doubt that anyone would have that as the purpose of clothing in that ideal society. And what we have also at the moment is a fashion industry that would not exist without the systemic exploitation of women, would not exist without the systemic exploitation of the global south, of people of colour, of the planet that we live on, and the animal kingdom as well. And this, you know, if you read the book, and I'm sure many of you here are fashion practitioners, and you will see and have experienced that this plays out in factory fires and factory collapses. It plays out in endemic gender-based violence and harassment. It plays out in state violence against trade unions when people strike to try and get a better living. And repeatedly it plays out as violence against animals and the land that we all live upon. So, yeah, what I want to do now is like just look at two quick examples to show how deeply structural many of the issues with the fashion industry truly are. And the first country I want to turn to is Sri Lanka. And I don't know if any of you have seen recently the pictures of the protesters jumping into the swimming pool in the presidential palace, having occupied it. So, you know, pretty sensational pictures, but reflecting a truly awful situation in Sri Lanka, where the country has run out of foreign currency and is basically running out of fuel and also running out of food as well. And you might be sitting there thinking, yeah, but like, what does that have to do like with fashion? You know, I came here for a fashion talk. Why are we talking about Sri Lanka's fuel and food crisis? Well, Sri Lanka is a fairly typical garment exporting country because in order to try and attract foreign currency, it has opened its borders up to garment companies and fashion companies to come in and use the factories that are within Sri Lanka. So, you know, they're making underwear for Victoria's Secret, like dresses for Marks and Spencer's. Next, you know, quintessential British brand Next owns an entire factory in Sri Lanka. And so Sri Lanka is making billions and billions of dollars in foreign currency, but it's not, you know, very hot sort of phrase at the moment, it's not trickling down. You know, here as well we're being sold this idea that money trickles down. It's not trickling down. What's happening is that it is, as Aaron Roy says, it's gushing up. So it's gushing up to the top of Sri Lanka society. You know, there's a very wealthy ruling class, which is very intermingled with the military in that country, and also it's gushing out of the country. So again, it's coming over to North America and to Europe. And so what has happened is that Sri Lanka has had to borrow and borrow and borrow billions and billions. And it's interesting there because, you know, whilst you've got China and Japan and India as some of the main creditors, if you look a bit deeper into it, you'll also see that there's some of these shady financial companies. For example, Sri Lanka is $3 billion in debt to BlackRock, who are one of a very shady company with their fingers in many, many pies. And what has happened is that to attract these companies, Sri Lanka has you know, worn away many of the regulations that are there to protect workers, you know, pesky things like maternity pay, holiday pay, sick leave, like that kind of thing. and has just concentrated on creating lovely conditions where you can just export garments. A lot of the time you see this model repeated with raw commodities, for example cotton, as well, where you have people, it's like, oh, rather than becoming kind of self-sufficient in food, let's grow cotton for export. And this has particularly impacted upon garment workers because these enormous loans, orchestrated by the IMF, come with really strict like repayment programs whereby countries are forced to not spend money on things like healthcare and public services, but have to pay back the debt. And a really shocking statistic that I found that is in recent years, over 40% of government spending was paying off interest on foreign debts. And again, you might be thinking, oh no, how much does this actually have to do with the fashion industry? And I just wanted to highlight one thing, that is, if you actively want to support garment workers right here, right now, it has got so bad that the Asia Floor Wage Alliance is currently raising money to pay for soup kitchens in Sri Lanka, because garment workers there currently do not have the money to feed themselves. So if you fancy going on asiafloorwage.org and just look up Sri Lanka Community Kitchen, you will find local groups who are very much in need of our solidarity and our help. I want to turn now, I know I don't have much time, so this is going to be a real kind of whistle-stop tour through this next topic, but I want to highlight it because it was one of the most interesting things for me to research and look into with the book. And it's very much like an issue that also, I believe, shows fashion as a performance of these deep structural issues, and that really goes to the heart of capitalism and colonialism. So I'm going to look briefly at this idea and the practice of indigenous fashion, and just to briefly say, why am I a white English person from London now in Leeds talking about the practice of indigenous fashion? And firstly, it was one of the best things that I got to research. Secondly, the practice of slow fashion or sustainable fashion is now so talked about that I think it's incredibly important that we credit people who have been doing this for millennia with the ideas that are now being talked about. And we don't just think that we invented it here in London or whatever. The third reason I want to talk about this is because this is this weird colonial moment in the UK, right? With the death of Queen Elizabeth, and now suddenly we have a new king, and you're not supposed to show any kind of objection to this, and you're not supposed to kind of feel a bit weird or really disgusted by Britain's colonial past and stuff. So I think it's important that we talk about this kind of thing. At this point in particular. The fourth reason is that the study of fashion in relation to human rights and the environment can often feel quite academic. You get dazzled by statistics and greenwashing and people arguing about what facts are real. But I think within indigenous fashion, in particular the case study I'm going to look at, you see just how closely these practices of environmentalism and human rights within the fashion industry are tied to the land and to political, lived, immediate, happening now political struggles for justice. So there's someone I want to introduce you to, theoretically. His name is Riley Coucherin. He's based in Canada. He's a First Nations fashion scholar. Totally recommend you go and find him on Instagram. He's got loads of chapters coming out in books. He'll have his own books within very soon. He's really interesting. And this is his definition of indigenous fashion. And so we've got this idea. It's basically is it slow fashion? Is it sustainable fashion? He's saying indigenous fashion is even better. There's a spiritual component that makes it far superior to any mainstream consumer fashion. And I have to obviously say here, it's impossible to give one definition of indigenous fashion that covers the entirety of the globe. I'm talking about First Nations in what's now called Canada. But what we have to see is that in every site that I've looked at, it's the antithesis of the destructive, compulsive, alienated mainstream industry that we all find ourselves living in. So Riley again. The supply chain of indigenous fashion consists of elders who share stories that provide directions to hunters, hide tanners, plant dyers, and medicine cultivators, weavers, sewers, and the designers who cultivate the process. And, really importantly, a truly indigenous fashion is grounded in land-based practices. So, it's this question of land that I really want to focus in on, because I think that when we really get into this, we can see a pathway not only for returning indigenous fashion to where and indigenous making to where it should be, and in putting justice back into that situation, but also as a way to shake not just the foundations of the fashion industry, but of capitalism itself. And really at the heart of this is this fundamental question of land rights. So, indigenous peoples now control under 0.02% of land in what is now called Canada. European settlers arrived in the 1600s, and by 1670, the Hudson Bay Company, a British company, had been established to ship beaver pelts and other things like that to Europe. So we took beaver pelts, and in return we sent alcohol and guns and smallpox and measles. And to the extent that originally in one province of Canada called British Columbia, the population there, First Nations population, exceeded 125,000 people in the 19th century. By 1929, there were just 22,000 Indigenous people left. And what happened, it's a hideous story that goes right to the heart of the British establishment. Corrupt, unfair treaties were signed. The buffalo, which for some groups of First Nation is intrinsic to life and to garment production, was all but wiped out. And then colonisation was then followed by this hideous piece of legislation called the Indian Act in 1876. And this created the reserve system that herded First Nations people into tiny tracts of land. And that's what you see now. And there's another particularly hideous example of the impact and the way that fashion is used as a colonial tool that comes out of this period, because this act decreed that First Nations children be forced into church-run residential schools as a deliberate way of severing them from their Indigenous identity. And one of the things that happened there is that children were not allowed to wear the clothes that they had grown up living, but were forced into wearing these Western-style suits and dresses as a deliberate tactic to split people from their identity. And in these, I don't even want to call them schools, in these residential institutions, the abuse was so bad that to date, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has documented 4,118 children who died in these places, which is an incredibly conservative figure, and it will rise and rise as more research is done. And this might seem historic, right? But it's not historic. The last of these institutions closed in 1996. And so when we start to look at that as as the lived context of Indigenous making and Indigenous garments and fashion, you can see that it is incredibly political. And Riley, again, this is a quote from him, where he says, "We need our land back. We need clean drinking water. We need safety and security. We need our women to stop disappearing. That is all required for us to have Indigenous fashion." And so expanding on this point, he then says, "Decolonisation must be expressly tied to the return of stolen land and the restoration of Indigenous sovereignty. But that won't matter if the land and water are poisoned and unlivable." And I just think, what if we apply this to the entire industry? What if we take it out beyond Canada to every part of the world? What if we apply it to the cotton fields in India and the jute fields in Bangladesh and the factories that dot our entire planet? And so that's why I have these 3 Ds that you mentioned, and I'll wrap up here. I'm sure people will have lots of questions. I'm very happy to answer questions and stuff, but just to leave you with this idea of the 3 Ds, which are degrow, democratise, and decolonise. And degrowth is an absolutely essential question. I'm sure everybody here shares the opinion that we cannot continue making the sheer volume of garments and shoes that we are currently making. So degrowth is the planned reduction of excess energy and resources by industries like the fashion industry, but with a caveat here, because once again, the climate crisis has been driven by the global north and then is impacting the global south, and you only have to look at the horrific photographs of what is happening in Pakistan at the moment to see that reality. So rather than making degrowth in the fashion industry something that just then re-punishes the global south, we have to make sure that it's done in a democratic way, which is then we come to the second D, which is to democratise. And currently, I believe there is zero democracy in the fashion industry, and I would like to see that change. I would like to see the means of production collectively owned. I'd like to see every part of creating a garment from design up to production completely democratised. And I think if we did have that where, not like Patagonia saying, oh, the earth is our shareholder, but if you actually had the workers in Bangladesh and in the cotton fields as the shareholders or owners, we would see something new. And then the third is obviously decolonisation. And to decolonise, I believe if we actually undertake a successful struggle to end exploitation and colonial practices throughout the fashion industry by completing a transfer of power and of land from the global north to the global south, and from the rich to the poor, from our shareholders to our farmers and our indigenous communities and our factory owners, that we will then end the fashion industry. There will be no more industry. And I think this is why fashion for me continues to be so important, because it is an industry where we hold the most intransigent problems with capitalism, with the exploitation of the global south, the exploitation of women, the ownership of land. These are all questions that we cannot escape as soon as we start looking at the fashion industry. So that's all from me. And if you want to get to grip with some more of these issues, I hope you will pick up a copy of the book. That's what it's there for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tansy. Thank you. So what we're going to do now, that's been a great overview of some of the key ideas in the book. But we also have an opportunity for questions and answers, so we can kind of ask specific things to individual panel members or pick out certain things from the book. How we'll go about this initially is I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel and of Tansy, and then there's space also for the audience to ask questions as well. So have a little think about things that you'd like to explore and ask. Obviously, if you've not read the book yet, it might be sort of general questions about fashion, about sustainability. But have a think, and please do make sure if you've got anything you want to ask that you do so. Okay. So, the book is really a fantastic read, and I do recommend that if anyone hasn't picked it up, that you do pick it up. It really kind of combines those topics around capitalism, references, thinkers, Marxist thinkers, as well as addressing very real and current industry-related topics. So I've got a few questions. Try and do this so that I'm not too ignorant to everybody. So, in the book you explain that fashion is intertwined with capitalism, and that without the fashion industry, without capitalism and without the exploitation of the global south, of women, without colonial trade practices, that fashion wouldn't exist. My question is, how have you maintained a passion for fashion when you're faced with all of its dirtiest, deadliest truths? How have you maintained that it's glorious and enthralling?
Thank you. Well, I'm still I'm not inspired by the top of the fashion industry, but I'm really inspired by sort of street level like fashion and making and stuff, and like the kind of stuff that people make for themselves or men for themselves, or that you see like in like clubs and like in the LGBTQ scene and stuff like that, where it's like interesting and people are a bit kind of like freer to like experiment like that inspires me. And then like I just keep writing about fashion, not because not because of the fashion, but kind of because of the sort of workers' rights aspect, really. Like I want to keep, particularly during the pandemic and last couple of years, like I just want to keep raising like these points. Like it's been such a difficult couple of years for people. Like Bangladesh, like Guatemala, Honduras, everywhere. It's been a maelstrom.
I must say that was the thing that I found most fascinating about the book, to really learn about all of that and understand it. So another thing that you mentioned in the book that I thought might be worth raising is this idea of mirrored debt. So within the fast fashion environment that we live in now, we have the debt of young people in the UK or Europe or the US who are purchasing fast fashion at a really high rate and getting in debt to do so, particularly with the rise of like payment plans like Klarna and Clear Pay and those kind of things. But that's mirrored by the debt that the garment workers and the workers of the global south take on in order to produce the material. So I found this idea of mirrored debt new and fascinating. If you could expand upon it a little bit, and also expand upon where else there's mirrors between consumers and producers at each end of that spectrum.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a great question. I mean, like, I think like the fashion industry is just not really working for anyone apart from like the people right at the top. So yeah, there's this idea of mirrored debt. Klarna, Clear Play. I mean, it's not just like the fast fashion. Clear Play just sponsored London Fashion Week. It's like every site that you go on is offering you, like these like it's like buy now, pay later. Like these credit things are not good for anybody. And then it just really struck me that like whilst this is going on, you've got workers, working people in like Pakistan, for example, who have, and across South Asia, where all the studies found that garment workers, like I think 70% of garment workers went into debt during COVID because the wages are just so low that people can't afford to save for a rainy day. If anything like COVID happens and you miss a few like months' work, like there's no money in the bank. There's nothing there for people. And then the other thing I think is really interesting and what I wanted to raise is like a new campaign has been launched like in this country just like last week, which is the Right to Clothing campaign, which I know Lauren is involved in, and that is basically trying to like highlight the fact that loads of people in this country do not have access to sort of healthy clothing, clothing that fits, clothing that keeps people warm. Unlike sort of food poverty, it's really hidden because people who can't afford clothes just stay in their houses. If you like, and so you kind of got this really corrupt, really ridiculous situation where workers have been driven into poverty by the fashion industry in the global south, and then the people made most vulnerable by capitalism in this country can't afford to buy the clothes that even the cheapest clothes that are being made. So it's just a really dysfunctional system, and with billions and billions and billions. The top 20 fashion brands finished the pandemic more valuable, with a higher share point than they went into it with. So yeah, it's broken.
I definitely, through reading the book, got a deeper understanding of that. Already understanding that people are exploited all the way throughout the fashion industry. But upon reading the book, really, really identifying all the different ways that people are exploited is important for us to understand as consumers and as activists and community members. You mentioned, Lauren, and the project that Right to Clothing?
Yeah, I would really encourage people to go and sign up and support them, literally Right to Clothing, and it's trying to put a rights-based template onto the garment industry, for people here, and it will link to living wage campaigns in the global south as well, so it's a good one.
Great, thank you. So I'll move on to Lauren now, actually. That would be a perfect timing. So Lauren is the director of the Leeds Community Clothing Exchange. Can you tell us a little bit about clothes swapping and how that connects to the need for sustainable fashion and also the current cost of living crisis?
Absolutely. So for anyone who's new to the concept of swapping, you bring clothing that you don't want anymore, that is of good quality, that you would be willing to give to another person, and then you can swap it for things that are more suitable for yourself. So it could be that you have changed size, it could be that you've got rid of your summer clothes and you want to go to your winter ones, it could be for all sorts of different reasons. And I think talking about the right to clothing is kind of critical to what we do. That there is all this clothing in circulation that could be going to a good purpose, that could be worn by somebody, and a lot of it is ended up in landfill, and that's a waste of the resources. And it's also a problem when we've got people in, not just in this country, all over the world, who don't have access to those clothing that would be useful to them. And I think that clothes are an amazing resource. It's not just, I think we think of fashion as a frivolous thing, that it's just, throwaway, it's just clothes. But actually, if you don't have the right clothing, that can keep you out of places, it can keep you out of employment, it can put you in danger, and that's kind of really critical to what we do. So we're kind of keeping those clothes in circulation, making sure that they are going to the people who need them, and that doesn't mean that it can't be fun. This rather fabulous dress I have on today, that came from the Clothes Exchange. It doesn't have to be, I think people think of, the sort of sustainable fashion being a kind of, Hessian sack, which, nobody wants to wear that. Fashion is fun, and it should be, but it should be fun for everybody. So, we don't want people to be exploited. We want people to have the clothing that they have a right to. So I think that's kind of what we do with the exchange, is offering a low-cost alternative. We charge a very low entry fee, which just covers our costs. We're not-for-profit. And the idea is you've got this resource in your wardrobe. If it's not working for you, swap it for something else and give those clothes to someone who can make use of them. Kind of what we're all about.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So, Tansy, just to go back to this idea of the mirroring or seeing things throughout the fashion industry that are repeated, there's appalling working conditions across the global south. Terrible situations such as factories collapsing, deaths of thousands of people, sexual violence, unlivable wages. And there's an intense pressure for turnarounds, but actually also in the UK, fast fashion in particular, but I do know that you don't really make a big distinction between high-end and fast fashion in this environment, has given rise to precarity, informality, low wages, illegal practices. So I just wondered if you could shed a bit of light on what's happening in the UK, particularly around big brands, newer brands that we are aware of in cities like Leicester and other big manufacturing cities.
This is, we talk about sort of workers' rights in the global south. Like it feels a bit like, the UK is sliding into sort of worse and worse situation. But Leicester is an awful situation that's happening with like British brands using British factories, using workers in Britain, and yet we're seeing people being paid kind of like about £3 an hour, and I mean this is partly due to a kind of bonfire of regulations that has taken place. Like we don't have a proper kind of factory inspectorate. We don't have the Gangmasters Association has been sort of worn down as well. There's very little kind of regulation around supply chains globally and in the UK. And also, you have this ridiculous situation where some of the people, not all of the people, some of the people in these factories are people who have an unsteady immigration status. So people are like very afraid to report like crimes that are being committed against them, and like a very easy way to fix that would be like, you know, which has been like, there's countries in Latin America that have this kind of model where if you report something like you know, that you're working in a sweatshop and being paid £3 an hour, that you are then like guaranteed like immigration status in this country, so you don't have this threat like hanging over you anymore. Yeah, but it's a ridiculous situation right here.
I know that Extinction Rebellion have been quite at the forefront of taking direct action against fashion brands, and I myself was involved in a few actions in Manchester around Boohoo headquarters, and I think that if anyone wants to learn more about those campaigns and that kind of activity, you just have to kind of Google Boohoo activism or Fashion Week, XR Fashion Week and things like that, and you'll be able to see that, you know, people fighting for kind of those workers' rights here in the UK as well. Very, very important that we recognise what's going on in Global South, of course. But just to note that in cities very nearby and locally even, potentially, there's a lot of hidden practices going on in the fashion industry. So, speaking to workers' rights, you quote in the book the Indian coordinator for the Age of Law Wage Alliance, Nandita Shivakumar, and she says, which I thought was really powerful and relevant, she said that consumer power cannot be at the forefront of the campaign, and that not enough money and not enough power is being built into the worker movement, as so much of the focus is on fashion resistance in terms of what we buy, when we buy less, buy better, don't buy at all. So much focus on the consumer. Can you expand on what Nandita means when she says that, and why the centering of consumer campaigning slows down the rate of progress?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one. I mean, I get why people focus so much on personal consumption. Like, obviously, fashion, footwear, like, it's so personal. You put it literally onto your skin, and so people immediately think when they come to fashion activism, okay, I need to change like myself, and I need to change like my wardrobe, and that's how we'll fix things. And in the book, I've done this thing called the triangle of change, right, which goes through individual, like, so it's literally a triangle and it's split into 3 parts. The top bit is individual change, and that's fine. Like, I totally think, like, you know, buy the most ethical things that you can, like buy secondhand, do like all this, the swap stuff is brilliant. You know, it's part of a blueprint for a better future, fine. Don't for a second think that it's going to like change things you know, it's not going to like fix what's happening in Sri Lanka. It's not, you know, it's not going to cancel the debt of workers in Pakistan. It's not going to return the land to like the First Nations communities in Canada and stuff like that. So then we have to move, and I would always encourage people to move into collective political change, where we take on, you know, where you work together with people to take on things like unfair trade agreements, ownership of land, minimum wage laws, you know, like severance laws, all these kind of things. And the good news is, there's already really great organisations doing this work in the garment industry. So, you know, XR Fashion are great, like Labour Behind the Label are great, War on Want are doing loads of work, like with Sri Lanka and lots of other countries. The Age of Law Wage Alliance that Nandita works for, like, are phenomenal. You know, and I mean, what Nandita I think is saying is that, like, it is damaging to progress in the fashion industry if we just put all our time and all our money and all our energy into like shopping and like shopping differently. Like, we're not helping. Like, you're not helping the workers' movement in Bangladesh or in India or Pakistan. Like, it's just not.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing that shines through in the book, is to address the workers' movements and collective action, as well as how we individually take on accountability and ownership as well. I'm going to now pass a few questions to the other panel members, and I'll kind of direct it to a person, but please feel free for people to jump in. I thought I'd do a quick time check first, make sure I know where we're at. So, I actually wanted to raise a question to, there's a couple of you on the panel, like educators within fashion or in general in university, and I'm sure there's some students in the space, or maybe even fashion students. The question I have is, in an environment where many of the graduate roles are in these large fashion organisations that are intrinsically linked to all of these problems, what kind of support and development, how can we help young designers and other fashion workers to actually contribute to positive change, to the revolution, when job security is so challenging as well?
Shall I take that one?
Yeah.
So yeah, we're in a really powerful position as educators and working at the university, because obviously we're teaching those future fashion designers and future fashion change makers. And we need to provide them with as much support as possible to start their own enterprises and to make the changes that we're talking about. Because as you say, when we go on placements, when we show them case studies, a lot of the time they are focusing on these big businesses that are the establishment. And we want to encourage the students to start their own companies or make changes. So we provide them with as much support as possible, but obviously it's a highly risky thing to go into. So there's obviously the financial side of it as well. So we really try to support them to make changes and to do something for themselves, because they're all so innovative. But the safe space is for them to go and work with Nike, with Boohoo, with some of these big companies. We want to really encourage the creativity and innovation amongst those students and help and support them. So when we're designing the modules, when we're developing the courses, that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, to take that. I mean, from my point of view, I actually think that HE has lost its way. And I think that actually, I would say, from my point of view, don't go to Russell Group University, because actually they're elitist and they carry on those systems. Sorry, but you know, 30 years that's I worked there, and I've been kicked out of HE. I'm not relevant, I'm not needed. And they dismiss what I do as a hobby. And I think, yeah, they're all part of that game. They're not going to challenge the supply chain. And I don't think they're doing it. So I hate to say that. As someone who went through an education system, and education should be for all, but I don't trust them at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure, yeah, there are places, and I'm sure there are, but I actually think we need to take education back down to the roots. Because they're educating people as well to be productive workers, you know, and to fit into that system. But you're right, we don't have the other systems in place. When you're talking about the factories, we need places for us creatives and us makers. Where are they?
Yeah.
Where's the funding for that? So
Yeah.
I hate to say, yeah, just avoid some of it. But, you know, there's an element where I think education needs reforming.
Well, it is really difficult if you're leaving a university position straight into some sort of graduate scheme placement in a massive organisation.
And
Doing
also,
a little piece of a job. David Graeber, was it, called it bullshit jobs?
yeah. And I think the way as well it's potentially taught, it's well for me in terms of the waste. You know, they're not taught to use waste. They're still taught those old ways in many ways.
Yeah.
And just one thing I'd like to pick up when you were saying about, there's a great writer called Otto von Busch, and he talks about how we hack into systems because we love them, not because we hate them.
Yeah.
And I think that's relevant here. That's why we're doing what we're doing. We love this. I love this, but I hate a lot of it as well. And that's, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's ask another question to the panel. I'm going to mix it up a little bit, going to change up the kind of line of questioning. So, going over to Esther again. Sorry, we've not had Jo speak up yet, so I'll come back to you next. So, going over to Esther again, your work specifically focuses on vintage fashion fairs and the unique, magic way we weave, or they weave, the physical but temporary spaces where the space as well as the clothes are reused, buildings like cathedrals, town halls and theatres, just like this amazing space.
Absolutely.
Left Bank. So, can you expand on why the physical environment in which clothes are exchanged is important?
Yeah, so when I walked into this building tonight, I thought, this is the space for me, this is what I love, this is second-hand buildings, second-hand clothes, which is what I research. So I looked particularly at vintage fashion fairs, and that combined with my past career as a visual merchandiser, creating spaces from a very top-down approach, almost controlling consumers to move around those spaces in certain ways. Let's put this in the window so we can make people buy it. Very much a science of consumer behaviour. What interests me about vintage fashion fairs and much more collaborative and democratic spaces is that they are owned by the community and that you can celebrate fashion, that joy of fashion, without that top-down approach. And it's a wonderful sharing collaborative space. And so space is my thing. As a visual merchandiser, that was the tool that I used, was manipulating that space. But now what I celebrate is a much more democratic use of the space. And these old buildings, so vintage fashion fairs, cathedrals, old hotel banqueting facilities, loads of different beautiful old buildings that otherwise wouldn't be used in a very similar way to this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's always great when it's not a Wetherspoons or a Starbucks that use the old building, isn't it? So, I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. Have a little think about what you might like to ask. And in the meantime, I will ask one question of Jo, because I'm conscious that you have not directed anything your way. Jo is the owner of Trad Collective, which is, and tell me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I've only ever seen it read, which is a sustainable fashion retailer. What I want to know is, so often, I've bought second-hand for years at this point, very rarely buying anything new. But there obviously is a place still sometimes for new items, and you offer a sustainable and ethical products. What exactly is it that your criteria is, or that you're looking for as a buyer? How do you even know it's sustainable and ethical, and how as consumers do we know that?
So, well, it's quite a big process figuring out like if it is sustainable, if the company's transparent, if it like actually fulfills the criteria we want them to. So obviously we want them to be as transparent as possible, and we always ask a lot of questions before we take on any new brands. We try to focus on local and small makers mainly, because as we grasped on a bit earlier, like, I do think it's important to give space to small creators that don't really have a space to actually sell their products. So that's our main focus when we find new brands, to find as local as possible. We also try and do as much upcycled as possible, because I personally myself believe that that's the most sustainable way of creating new garments. And I don't know, it's...
I do recommend you check out the stalls, by the way, of both Jo's and Karen's collections, as well as check out Trad in Headingley. Awesome shop. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are quickly running out of time. So what I'd like to do is encourage people in the audience to ask questions. The book covers so much climate change, colonialism, and racism throughout the fashion industry. So there's loads we haven't covered in this short time. So please ask any question you want. I'll use this little...
It is really hard as a designer and as someone who uses recycled materials. I mean, I have had stuff ripped off by Primark. You know, it's a dress that was made out of all recycled materials, and you know they converted it into their sort of style. But it's very hard. You don't have a lot of power, you know. And also, if you imagine that they can get away with, I think it's 5 different things you have to change. So again, with something like the field that I work in, it is hard. To do that, to protect yourselves.
Yeah. I think as well it goes to educating yourself about the clothing that you're wearing. You know, we at the exchange we get thousands of items come through every month. I can tell if it's come from Boo just by touching it. I don't even have to look at the label. And it's kind of educating yourself about the fabrics that you're wearing, about the construction of your clothing. You know, if you're wearing something that's been made really cheaply with no seam allowances, you're not going to get wear out of it because it's going to come apart. Whereas if you can find something that has had more care put into it, it will last you longer, you can repair it. And so I think it's once people realise that actually, yeah, you might be able to get a knockoff version for a fraction of the price, but it's going to last half the time, it's not going to be as comfortable to wear, it's not going to look as good. And it's kind of, that's how I think we can help to address that we're not all just looking at the price and going, well, I want it, so I'm going to pay the cheapest possible price. We think, well, if it's something that you really want, it's an investment, you should be caring about these things and trying to keep them going as long as possible, and that goes back to the education, really.
I do remember being a kid in the 80s in Beeston in Leeds, desperately wanting those trainers out of catalogue, and my mum would never get them out of the catalogue, and wanting the branded trainers. So I do think that is the stigma of poverty, the stigma of not having the right clothes is huge, isn't it, particularly for working class communities and children.
Yeah, it's one of the really poisonous bits of the fashion industry, and it's sort of starting younger and younger and younger. Where you've got like 6-year-olds and stuff who want to have like brand name shoes, and are stigmatized and teased if they don't have that. I think we need it's one of the things I would love to get rid of as part of overhauling the fashion industry, is to remove this element of class from dress, from what is accessible to people, and kind of trying to tear off this the way that people kind of identify with brands and identify with the idea of a brand, above kind of identifying from the things that are actually meaningful in life. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how you convince 6-year-olds or 10-year-olds that they don't need a pair of Nike trainers. I mean, the other book I wrote was on the footwear industry, and I spent a lot of time at a place called SneakerCon, where you've got the XL Centre full of teenage boys, primarily teenage boys, some teenage girls, but primarily teenage boys, all completely obsessed, with shoes and with swapping shoes and reselling shoes. But I mean, part of it wasn't all negative. I mean, for them, a lot of them, were quite did feel quite invisible into wider society, and so within the sort of sneaker community, they had this space where the stuff they did mattered, and they were experts within their world, and and they had their own ways of creating value for themselves and stuff. So it's not all negative, but I definitely think, in an ideal society, a Nike tick on a shoe wouldn't sort of determine how cool you are or how valued you are or anything. It's
Yeah, and I think sneakers, that's that sneaker con is a subculture, isn't it, where people will obviously have an artistic kind of approach to it, so I can understand why it wasn't all negative. But small children that feel immense pressure when they can't afford shoes is the upsetting thing, isn't it? Particularly when you look at that mirror idea of the workers, of the children of workers in the global south, very unlikely to have, branded sneakers, for example, and things like that. But they're making them,
There was a project that myself and Sue actually did a while back, which was a financial inclusion project, and that was part of it, because I think part of that was actually, getting back into making and customising, and we're doing workshops and things in shopping centres until they moved us out, because people said, this is better than shopping. It's of course, that's what we want, so we can use Nike. But we're within this financial inclusion project, it's very much working with people who, we're spending actually quite a lot of money, but all those clothes were in the wardrobes, they weren't wearing them, and he was saying, actually £25, we're going to the suit, to second-hand clothes, you can make something yourself and then get them onto the catwalk. And then it became about the body, not just about the clothes and how they felt about that.
Yeah, cool. Financial inclusion project is, what was it, have a specific?
It was working with the housing
association,
so we're working mainly with people who didn't have a lot of money, but were actually still spending quite a lot of money on clothes.
Yeah.
Because it was about that identity, as you say, but then when they were putting them on, they didn't match, they weren't right, and was helping them.
Yeah, especially when you're following trends, I suppose, as well. You might not identify with it personally. Is there another question at the back?
I think, like, I mean, everyone please chime in, but I think people care more now about where things come from and who's making them and the environmental impact of those things, possibly than ever before. But I think it's made incredibly difficult, like, for people to know, like, what to do about it. Like, that's what I've tried to, like create this book to sort of arm people, because it's this sense of, like, okay, I know everything's, like, fucked up, and I know capitalism is horrible, but, like, I don't know what to do, and there's a lot of, like, kind of coded language now around sustainability that, because, like, brands can just, like, make up words and put them on labels, and then, it's just designed to make you more comfortable so that you'll go and then buy that. And there's a lot of problems with, with all aspects of the fashion industry, but I think, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, I think people care more now than ever before, and I think that will only increase. But it's up to, like, us and you guys, to sort of help people understand what they can then do. Like, what does it mean to be a fashion activist? Like, how do you work in solidarity with workers in the global south? Like, how do you stop the fashion industry trashing the planet? Like, what does that practically look like? That isn't, like, just shopping. What does that look like?
I think it's what you were saying in the book, though, about you can't shop away out of this. And I think that's the problem. We've become so addicted to shopping and that being the answer. And I think you're right, that, yeah, people do care, but I think but how do we? Is it because we've just become, shopping has become such a necessary part of people's lives, or so they think, that, yeah, it becomes very important, but actually, yeah.
I actually think that fashion industry in general is one of the main ways that people are distracted from that feeling of caring about all of the issues that we talk about that are linked, climate change, racism, poverty in the global south, a war on the working class globally, rise of fascism, all of these things. I think people do really care, and I'm speaking from a point of view of, like, having conversations in activist type circles and things like that. People really do care, and I think that it's very overwhelming to know what an individual can do. And the fashion industry is actually a very good vehicle for the capitalists and the billionaires to offer us a choice, because we've got no choice over so much in our world. So as much as it's about, do they care about what's going on in the fashion industry, I think the fashion industry is actually a dummy for not having to care about those big broad issues, and it's very much a good example of what all those wider issues are. Thank you, great question.
Yeah, I mean, so this is where you start to see that, like, just how structural the problems within fashion are, because, in order to, like, raise the way, like, in order to sort of completely change the fashion industry, to make it sustainable so that people are paying more for clothes, in order that, the materials are better sourced and that workers are paid better, we would need to transform this society as well. Like, as we, head into, like, yet another cost of living crisis, it's extremely difficult to, like, ask people to pay, like, larger amounts of money, like, for clothes. So, like, the living wage campaigns are really important in Bangladesh and the global south, but it's also, like, really important here, which is why I think, campaigns like the right to clothing have to be linked. It has to be global north and global south. It's the same question, it's the same problems that people are facing, because, as I'm sure you all agree, like, sustainable fashion is not accessible for people generally, like, it's not mass market, because it is more expensive and it is better made, and
especially when you get used to shopping in charity shops.
Yeah.
Like, I'm used to paying like £3 or something, for something really great, really amazing in the charity shop. So you have to sort of shift your thinking a lot when it comes to buying sustainable fashion.
Yeah, but we need, like, the ability to save is like a reflection of your class. Like, when people are, like, ending the month on, like, payday loans and stuff, like, it's just not really, it's not realistic. But the good part of that is that, like, okay, so we need to transform UK society as well, which we all know anyway, but we need people here to have like an excellent quality of living so that they can have beautiful things that are going to last like a lifetime and stuff. And that is, you know, that is something we should be aiming for. It's not just changing things in the global south, but we need, you know, we need to change things here.
Thank you. And I know that Jo has a sustainable fashion retail brand, so I wondered if you wanted to add anything in terms of like feedback that you've got from some of the products. I bought my first new item for a long time in Jo's shop. A really great t-shirt, really, really cool t-shirt. So I don't know if you want to contribute to anything any more to that.
Sorry.
We'll take a pause.
I'm just
Sorry,
going to
we'll
pause. Like, there's like one train that will get me back before midnight to London, and it leaves in like 20 minutes. So I'm really sorry, but I have to get that train. But honestly, thank you so much. It's a real honour to be here, and thank you for